think so much in the true crime genre allows people to gawk and you know we they love to unravel a mystery. They think they're going to solve something by reading about it, watching, listening. But I think also we're just as human beings attracted to things that are lurid and extremely scary. We love to scare ourselves.
Is someone, we talked about this a little bit the last time that you were on the show, but as someone who's been involved in hardcore investigative reporting related to crime for most of your career, what do people who are gawkers or who are consuming true crime content, what do they perhaps not understand about the criminal mind or about the nature of these cases?
Well, I think what we tried to do with my podcast, I should say our podcast, because it was an absolute team sport to do Suspect, was that, you know, that this is really about somebody who lost their life or somebody who was victimized. And all of the people outside of that person, whether it's their immediate family or the friends that they knew, that's really where the story lies. The story really should not be focused. I feel strongly, should not be focused on the person who committed the crime. Sometimes you have people who committed crimes who are so complex and um, so interesting that you do end up focusing a lot of time on them. And we did do that in this podcast. But I'm very uncomfortable with a lot of people who say they're true crime fans, because that to me says, okay, they're just seeking out this content rather than, okay, is this a good story, well told, versus am I just interested in the gory, lurid nature of it?
And we got into this a bit in the last interview that we did, but something that I personally can't consume this type of content, particularly when it relates to children. And you're a mom, and I would love to talk about that a little bit. But I'm just curious, the more you go into this, and particularly with this project and the fact that the victim was a child, how does that impact you as a mother, and how do you navigate that emotionally?
Sure. So Suspect, the story is about a 12-year-old girl who disappears from her home in 1984. And it's a big mystery as to what happened to her, but it's pretty quickly deduced that she was kidnapped from her home in 84. And this was like the era of stranger danger. And I'm not giving anything away because you hear this right away in episode 1. Her body was found by some oil and gas workers digging a pipeline in 2019. So of course, it did land differently to me doing this story, having become a mother 3 years ago, because I started to focus kind of on this story 3 years ago, when my daughter was just born. I have kind of an opposite reaction to some people who say I can't consume or I can't report that kind of content. It's an extension of my mama bearness to get even more angry that someone would hurt a child. I mean, I would say my entire career is driven by outrage. I take it so personally, which isn't necessarily healthy, when I feel like people have been hurt, especially children. And a huge chunk of my career has been spent focusing on kids who have been hurt, either by an institution or an individual. I mean, I covered foster care and state welfare in Florida for 4 years. Um, so I felt drawn to Janelle, who is the 12-year-old who was kidnapped and killed, that we tell her story in Suspect. Um, because I had a daughter, because Janelle was adopted, my daughter is adopted. Um, it only strengthens my connection to these stories rather than repels me.
Why this story specifically, of all the stories that were probably exploring at the time, or all the different leads that you were thinking about creating content about next? Why this story?
So in 2019, I caught the news. I was on maternity leave, and I caught the news that this girl had been found. But then, if you fast forward to 2020, I'm at work at CNN at the time, and I'm in between stories, and I'm just looking at the news, and I see a headline that says two-time gubernatorial candidate arrested for decades old cold case. I mean, that's a hell of a headline. And I thought, oh, what's that? I get so many of my stories from, I see larger stories in smaller stories almost all the time. And so I thought, well, I have some time. Let me pull this indictment and see, how they got this guy. And it was the most unusual indictment I'd ever read. And I've read, hundreds of indictments over the years. And it just listed all of these instances in which he had tried to get the attention of law enforcement, but he was ignored. And I thought, oh, there's a big story here. And I became, kind of obsessed with it. And immediately, I think the same day, must have filed at least 10 records requests and ended up filing at least, I don't know, probably 30 or 40 more records requests to figure out this guy's paper trail, like just dig into everything. And I did that all on my own time, by the way. I did not do that it wouldn't have been a big deal if I did it on CNN's time. I was looking into a story, but I spent my free time, what little I had of it in 2020 doing that.
What are the specific elements? You've named a few of them, I think, but when you kind of break down, okay, what is the equation that makes this a standout or unique story? What are the other elements in the mix?
Well, I found the suspect at the core of our podcast fascinating and complex and twisted. So all the characters in the story were rich and interesting. And I say characters, let's not forget they're real people with real lives. But also that I thought it could maybe teach us some universal truths about what we think danger looks like and how wrong we can be when we make assumptions about people. Do we miss things that are right in front of our face sometimes? It had all of these themes that I thought were really interesting. And of course, I was attracted to it because there is a storyline involving Janelle's adopted family and her birth mother that I felt personally connected to. Each story is different, but it's funny, Andy, I really don't ever think about this kind of thing. I just know when a story is going to be a good story. I don't really try to think, oh, does it check all my boxes?
That's interesting because I would assume that underneath that, there must be like a proprietary Ashley algorithm that consciously or subconsciously is putting together like all the different elements of a story that would make it something compelling that you want to spend several years of your life on. I'm making an assumption, but
no, that's right. And with on our previous episode, we talked about the rape kit project, which showed that law enforcement across the country were trashing rape kits. 90% of them not tested, even just a couple weeks or a month or two after victims reported. That was a project I did for CNN. I think the more that I dug into that story, again, the angrier I got for those rape survivors. And I was kind of angry for the police who had never been trained properly in how to investigate sexual assault. So I can be very intense probably to work with. I think anybody would tell you that. But had to see that through no matter how complicated it got.
So it was a 3-year process, more or less, from when you first had the idea until the podcast dropped?
Oh, no, for the podcast, no. I would say, well, yeah, he was arrested in 2020 and I started doing work on my own, but I didn't leave CNN until the spring of the next year in 21.
Got it.
And that's when, Matt and I started talking about, what are the potentials here for this podcast? What company is going to bankroll it? And Wondery came through in a wonderful way. Amazon and Wondery.
I was going to say, Ashley, for people who don't understand or are not conversant in that side of the process for how these shows come to life, the development process, How does that work? And how did you transition from doing the type of reporting and producing the work product that you did to becoming someone involved in podcast world and having a number one hit?
Yeah, it's been nice to see the podcast at number one for a while. Um, well, let me just preface this by saying this is just my experience that I'll describe, because I'm still very much an infant in the world of podcasting. This is my first experience, and this is the way it was done, for me at Campside Media, which is such a juggernaut in podcasting because they're staffed by experienced long form journalists. And that's why their storytelling is so much higher quality than the majority of the crap that you're going to get, so much in the podcast space today. So my experience was that I did some reporting, and that reporting and recording went into a trailer that we made for what we thought the show could sound like. And then the trailer went out to potential buyers like Amazon, Wondery. I think actually they bought it right away, is my understanding. And we didn't go to other places like Sony or some other people in the podcast space. But in general, my understanding is that is how it often works. You will do a trailer, you will see who's interested in buying it. Then I have my shout out to Nancy Prager, my incredible entertainment attorney, such a great person, helped me understand the contract process. And then a team was put together at Campside with Matt Scher, Eric Benson, Ashley and Craig Bond, Sierra Franco. My really the biggest help that I had with writing by far, in a way, was Matt Scher and Eric Benson, who have had so many hit podcasts. And Matt Scher was the host of season 1 of Suspect. So they taught me how to write a podcast. It's such a different medium. It's such a different medium than magazine writing, which is what I had done traditionally.
What was new and different about writing for podcasts versus magazine or feature writing?
Well, I mean, you have to let the audio lead the way, which sounds like a big duh, but that's very hard to do. I mean, in writing, you can create any scene that you want. Of course, it has to be based in fact. And then you can introduce whatever somebody happened to say, but you have to write around the audio. And if you don't have keen audio, crisp, colorful audio, you cannot, obviously, you just can't do a podcast. You can't fake it. So you have to make sure that that is together. And also, don't step on the tape. Don't write something that feels redundant to what your audio is actually telling people. And try as much as possible to get out of the way and let the audio tell the story.
When you were capturing audio, did things always go as planned, or did anything unexpected happen?
Well, I often worked with a producer. Sarah Vitak was a wonderful producer that I worked with in Colorado. So I let her handle the recording. And that is, I can't speak to the way it works elsewhere, but that is often the way it works with Campside, because Campside is working with journalists, kind of print journalists often, because we do know how to tell a long form story, but they're not relying on us to be tech wizards and record everything perfectly. That would be disastrous. So I didn't have anything really go awry. I have much more confidence that I could record in the field now, but I did not have that in the beginning.
How about just from a reporting point of view, were there any dead ends? Were there ever moments where you had to pivot the story that you'd planned to tell, or did this unfold kind of the way you thought it was going to unfold?
There's no story unfolds the way you think it's going to unfold ever. I mean, there were a ton of dead ends. I would say the biggest obstacle that we faced was that the suspect in our show, he was tried in October 21 for murder and kidnapping. And the end of that trial was a mistrial. So that's very difficult for a reporter because, while the trial's going on, we're not anticipating a mistrial, whether he's found not guilty or guilty. All the parties, the cops, the prosecutors, the family, the witnesses, they're all agreed to talk to me, you know? But then when that mistrial happens, what happens? They need to shut up. They need to not talk to the media until there's a second trial. And that second trial isn't coming for another full year. So you better find a way to tell this story without 90% of your characters, without talking to the police directly. And I was totally scared. I think any other media company would say we can't do this podcast, but Matt Scher and Eric Benson said, "Yeah, of course we can tell this podcast. We're moving forward." And I was so heartened by that. And the way that we did it was we used a lot of audio from that trial that we recorded, and because I somehow got people who were witnesses in the second trial to talk to me. And I was stunned. I'm always stunned when people talk to me when maybe they really shouldn't because they were going to be witnesses. And that could really impact their ability to be witnesses in the second trial. But nevertheless, they talked to me and gave me great stuff.
How did you get them to talk to you?
I don't know. I mean, what helps me is I can show them a body of work that says that I'm a serious journalist, and so that I think they trusted me after they saw some of my previous investigative work. But also, I think every journalist needs to go to the trouble to explain your fact checking process, how stories go through a legal process, because we take for granted as journalists that people understand that they don't know how that works. And I said, I will tell you exactly the audio that we use in the podcast. I'm a big believer as an investigative reporter in there being no surprises. If you're accusing somebody in a story, as we did with the Rape Kits Project, the police of destroying evidence wrongly, every single police department knew exactly what we were going to say. And we actually asked them to fact check our own work and calculations and how many kits they destroyed and why. I mean, I just think that's a best practice, and not a lot of too few journalists do it.
In those conversations, or when you were approaching people to interview them for the show, what is a conversation like that like? What do you actually say to people? The first call or the first contact?
Yeah, I mean, you just very clearly explain what you're doing. And then you say, I understand if you don't want to talk right now, can I send you an email explaining who I am? You can check me out if you'd like, but whether it's, I want to talk about Janelle, your experiences, with her growing up, or I want to talk about how the police handled or mishandled, is more appropriate, the investigation for years. People are smart. They make their own decisions as to whether or not they want to talk. If somebody tells me, look, I do not want to talk, then that's it. I mean, you don't call them back. But there's ways to have very genuine exchanges with people, to sort of get them to the table, to get them to talk. And that is not about manipulating people, but just, if you have a genuine interest in telling a story, people read that. They understand that. And I think they respond to that well.
I think that's part of what I was curious about. So it sounds like for these interview subjects who have become part of the story, part of it is they feel your intent in what you want to do, and that you're not there to manipulate them or to bamboozle them into some outcome.
Absolutely. People are savvy. If you're just out there to get your story, then, I mean, I would never talk to a journalist who I thought that they owned the story. This is not my story. This is really Janelle's story, her family's story. And it's also the story of the people around the person who kidnapped and killed Janelle.
And when the podcast dropped, when it came out, where were you?
Well, the day before the podcast came out, I was in the hospital at Stanford University because at the same time I was reporting suspect, I learned that I had a rare and dangerous congenital heart defect that necessitated open heart surgery. So, you know, Andy, you and I have known each other for a really long time, since college, and I know how athletic you are, and I have been a distance runner since, you know, my late teens. And so it was a big shock to learn that I had this defective ticker. Uh, so anyway, the day before the podcast, I was actually meeting with the surgical team at Stanford, and they were going through all the potential complications with me, um, about what could happen during or after my surgery. So honestly, I guess the silver lining is I wasn't stressing out about how my podcast was going to do. I was more interested in, was I going to live?
What were some of the complications or potential outcomes of the surgery?
Well, I should say that I went to arguably the best surgeon in the world. I had the privilege of being able to do that. So I did have complete faith in him. I have complete faith in very few people, but there's something called a phrenic nerve, which kind of runs sort of behind you down your spine, and it goes very close to your heart, and it controls your diaphragm. And if that gets torqued or damaged, you can just stop breathing. Um, you can't live without your diaphragm. Um, he had to. I had an anomalous right coronary artery, which means my right coronary artery was in the wrong place, and he was transplanting it into the correct location. So he has to punch a hole in the right side of my heart. And I remember very vividly one of the doctors saying, if he's off just a little bit, you'll have problems for the rest of your life. And I said, what is problems? It's like, oh, lots of surgeries. And I went, okay, well, let's hope that he punches the hole in exactly the right place. So I think we would have been there all afternoon, frankly, if they would have been telling me every single potential disaster.
Yeah, and to open a glimpse into life behind the podcast, we had a conversation before you had the surgery. I'm glad to hear. It sounds like you were very optimistic and relaxed. Personally, I was like, okay, there's a non-zero chance Ashley might die. I was upset. I thought about that. I was very, you're here, so it worked out, thankfully. But you're going in there, you have the surgery the next day, and the podcast comes out, and as you said, you had bigger things to think about. But subsequently, a lot has happened with the podcast and with your heart as well. So what happens on the other side of the surgery? You wake up, like, what's going on?
I do want to take a moment here, though, to talk about behind the podcast. All of your listeners need to understand what an incredible friend you were and are to me. And, you were there for me every second, whether you were sending me some funny audio text or asking me how I'm doing. And, you really, we've always been good friends, but you really stepped up in a way that was so touching, and I will never, ever forget it. So all of your listeners need to know that you're not only a great podcaster, but you are such a genuinely loving, good person. I'm just so grateful for you. Okay, now let's put that aside. And so I mean, the truth is I wasn't really thinking about how well Suspect was doing on the charts. I should say at the time it was released, it was behind a paywall. It's no longer behind a paywall. So when I woke up from open heart surgery, the one thing that happens to you is you're really thirsty. It's the thirstiest you've ever been in your life. And that's a result of anesthesia. And I was just super out of it. I was on narcotics. One thing that they have to do to you within 24 hours or shortly thereafter is you have tubes you have wires connected to your heart, and you have tubes connected to your lungs that are draining fluid. And so when you're awake, they have to pull the wires out and they have to pull those tubes out. So before the surgery, I looked at every YouTube video of what happens after surgery to prepare myself. And so I was ready. It wasn't a surprise to me. Um, and to be honest with you, I was so grateful that to have woken up that I was like, whatever, there's nothing, they could punch me in the face. I don't care what happens. I'm fine. I'm good. I mean, my husband took a video of me the moment that I woke up giving a thumbs up, like a Maverick Top Gun. Like, it's like, yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm alive. Anyway, two nurses stood on both sides of me, is my recollection anyway, and yanked all that out of my abdomen. And I mean, it hurt for sure, but it actually felt good. It felt actually really good because I felt like I really earned that pain. And I kept kind of saying to my husband, "Are you getting this? Are you rolling on this?" And he's like, "I don't want to take a video." I'm like, "Take a video." Uh, anyway, that's really what I mostly remember when I woke up.
I feel like the behind the music on this is going to be incredible. I mean, I don't know if the docu-series is underway, but there could be something about the making of. It would be pretty incredible, I think. And okay, so you lived. That's the good news, and you're an incredible person, and I'm lucky to have you be my friend, and I care deeply about you. And I felt really fantastic when I got the Care Bear network, or there's a special private social network. If anybody out there has had a loved one, friend, family go through a procedure these days, there's a private social network.
It's called Caring Bridge, if anyone wants.
It's called
Caring Bridge. Yeah.
It's called Care Bear.
Care Bear.
And yeah, also known as Care Bear. And so you get the updates. So I saw the, video of Ashley doing her Top Gun Maverick thumbs up, which was incredible. And then they kind of had you propped up like Frankenstein. I don't know. Actually, I don't know if you're propped up at that point. Later, they got you up to 45 degrees. And I remember you telling me before the surgery, I'm going to be sleeping at 45 degrees. And I thought privately, like Frankenstein,
Yeah.
for like 6 months, but you progressed much faster than that, which we could talk about. But on the other side of that, and you're an intense person, I would say you're a very focused, goal-oriented person. Watching you go through this experience from initially when you started to have some things going on with your heart, which you shared with me at the time, and then you went through this whole process. And as an outsider and as your friend, I was like, you're just so methodical and goal-driven, and not, at least as an observer, you did not get jammed up in the potential of things going wrong or in a highly emotional state. That's what it felt like from the outside, that you were, navigating it in a very logical way. When you did wake up, though, and you were conscious, you're like, I'm alive. This at least worked to this point. Did you feel relief? Did you feel like, this is about what I expected? How did that feel?
I was really surprised that I wasn't feeling any pain. Of course, it's strange because you also have a line into your carotid artery. And I was prepared for that as well. I do want to say, though, that, when I was diagnosed, I did spin out for a solid 2 or 3 weeks. So everyone should give themselves permission to lose it. And, I've cried to you. I cried to you during the process. I definitely tried to be in touch with those emotions and not bat them back. But I get a lot of strength from gathering information. That's just my personality. And so I went to town, and the more information I gathered, the more I knew that the outcomes of this surgery were very good. So, I don't know if I would have been as calm without that, or without this actually a support group on Facebook that I joined, and people who were a wealth of information. So I felt very supported too, beyond my friends and family. Um, so anyway, I'm trying to think back in those first couple of days and how I felt. I, I don't know. I also was super arrogant that I was just looking back on it now. I was pretty arrogant and thinking, yeah, cool, I'm done. They're done. I could just get up and walk out of here. And that is not, my body was like, oh no, you're not. You're going to be really messed up for a pretty long time.
Can you describe what being messed up for a long time has felt like so far?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first month, you're just very, very exhausted. All you want to do is sleep, even though that's not what you should be doing. You should be getting enough rest. You should be constantly be walking. You know, my one thing that was very uncomfortable is that my resting heart rate prior to the surgery was about 55. And after the surgery, because your sinus node is kind of rung like a bell during surgery, that governs your resting heart rate. My resting heart rate jumped about 40 points. So that's very uncomfortable to go from 55 to like 95. Um, and just the first couple of weeks after the surgery, we stayed in California. My mom, husband, daughter, and sister-in-law and best friend. We brought a whole crew of people out there. And I just walked around the parking lot of our long-term stay hotel with my mom very, very slowly. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have a mother who mothered me for 2.5 weeks back in Atlanta, 2.5 months, I should say. And I couldn't, I couldn't push or pull anything. I couldn't lift my arms. I couldn't lift my arms out that way. I was just like this. I couldn't pour my own cereal. I definitely couldn't pick my kid up. It was, I did lose it when we came back here one day because my husband was outside with our daughter and my mom had taken a walk and I was alone and I just felt like a total invalid. I couldn't do anything. And I got so angry. I just started slamming everything down. I took a dish outside and I broke it in the driveway. And I was crying and I was screaming inside. No one was in the house. My husband didn't notice that I was breaking a dish in the driveway, even though he was outside. Um, it's really hard. And people go through depressions after open heart surgery, which before I didn't really understand because I thought, why would you be depressed? You're alive. But I've had bouts of that.
And you didn't mention this, Ashley. You had a choice whether to get this procedure or to just continue, correct?
Yes, what's so tricky about these anomalous coronary arteries is if they're found in children, the general rule is it's good to get it surgically fixed. If you've made it to adulthood, there is a kind of mentality in the medical world that just leave it alone. You've made it this far. But because of the contours of my particular anomalous artery, it was made pretty clear to me by Stanford that sure, you could live, but you could also drop dead. You know, you have an option. You can roll the dice and see if you live. That's true. We're not going to force you to have this surgery. We don't think you're going to die right this second. And it's just an impossible place to be in. I mean, when I was diagnosed, I was suddenly afraid to be alone with my 3-year-old because what if something happened to me? You know, so I would only take her in public places knowing that someone would help her if I dropped. When my husband had to go out of town once, I had friends come over. I mean, it's just not the way to live. It makes you feel very incompetent as a parent. Even though your rational brain is like, that's ridiculous. You didn't cause this. This is not your fault. You're trying your best. you know, even just this weekend, even though I'm 3 months out from surgery, I can't really wrestle my 3-year-old very well. It hurts. So she was throwing a fit in a toy store. And I normally would just like bear hug her and take her out of there, but I couldn't do it. And it was getting so out of control that all I did was just slump down in the store and started crying and called my husband. And I was upset for hours. So it can be, it can take away your sense of agency and your sense of the control you might think you have over your life.
How has it shifted, if it has, your relationship to your body generally, or how you think about being an embodied consciousness?
Yeah, I think I had, before I really didn't think too much about my health other than, going to an annual physical and being told I was fine. Um, I also made my body do hard things with long runs. Um, by the way, I mean, you and I both feel like endurance sports are often very damaging to the heart. But I did a lot of them. I know you did, in our 30s and 20s. Um, Now I see how quickly things can turn. Even now, I'm having a complication related to this surgery where I thought, oh, after open heart surgery, I'm going to be fine. I'm back. I even feel good enough to run. And now, I just learned that I think I've had it since the surgery was over, but a partially collapsed lung and a messed up diaphragm because either somebody or somehow during the surgery, my phrenic nerve was damaged. That's going to heal, and I think I'm going to be fine. But I think about death more often than I would guess most 46-year-olds think about.
Has that shifted how you think about how you spend your time today, now, what you want to do in the future?
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of work, I'm never going to do something that I don't want to do again, ever. Um, and I totally recognize that I'm financially in a situation where I can say I have the privilege to say that. Um, but like I'm never going to work with another mean editor again. Like I did in my last like year at CNN. Um, I'm not going to put up with witnessing people being nasty to each other and not intervening. Um, there's just certain things that I have no tolerance for anymore. Yeah, and I mean, I always spend a lot of time with my husband and daughter, but seeing friends, I think maybe before I would have been like, oh, I don't want to get on a plane. It seems like a lot. No, I'm getting on every plane I can this year and going to see everybody, including you. Are you thinking about what we're gonna like do? Is that
Yeah,
what the pause?
no,
I
what the
want to go
pause
like
is.
fishing or whatever you do in Maine.
Yeah, the pause.
Lobsters.
I'm thinking about how it's going to be negative 16 degrees this weekend, which that could be a different kind of life experience to have. That you didn't have that in Missouri. I don't know if you've had that in other places. I'm just thinking about all that Maine has to offer. The
Yeah,
half pipe in the backyard. You could skate.
absolutely. Look, I'm looking to get any kind of traumatic chest injury I can this year. So put me on a chest or put me on a half pipe or, definitely do some roller skating, hang gliding, bungee. It's all on my calendar this year.
We've got it all here in Maine. Ashley, come on down.
Believe it.
So while all of this is going on, I'm curious what the experience has been like of, if anyone listening to this is following you on Twitter or Instagram, you of course have now had the experience of people probably have this fantasy of like, what if the thing that I do is it's a giant billboard in Times Square or like it goes to number one. You've had those things happen to you in the past couple of months. And there are things that most people realistically aren't going to experience in a lifetime. I believe every person can have those kinds of experiences, and that's part of what this show is about. But you've now actually had them with this project.
Yeah.
What does it feel like?
It's super satisfying. I mean, I have to temper any kind of rah-rah for myself with two things. I worked with the best people in podcasting at Campside Media. And two, we had the marketing machine of Amazon and Wondery behind the show. The show's a great show. I'm very, very proud of it. And I'm proud of the work that I did on it. And I hope that Janelle's family is happy with it. They are. I've been in touch. But I also think it is a lot of luck that I happen to have this random conversation with Matt Scheer that led to this podcast, that led to Wondery and Amazon. Having a billboard in Times Square for your show, for your first podcast, it's very heady. It's pretty cool. I wish, I could get up to New York and see it. Friends have gone by and excitedly taken videos for me. And to have the show, be the number one show, in the States, and I still think it's number one in true crime for at least a couple weeks is also mind blowing. I mean, I couldn't be happier, but I also don't want to get overly confident. I'm working on the next show now. And, you just have to keep your head down and focus on the journalism and not think, oh yeah, this is going to be my second hit. Not at all. It's like, now it's time to get to work on the next one.
What kinds of stories do you want to tell going forward? I mean, you talked a little bit about some of the environments or situations you don't want to be in from a work point of view on the other side of this hard experience, or while you're still, it's going to be an ongoing thing for the rest of your life, right? Having had the experience with this show, what types of stories do you want to tell next? And was there anything you learned from this experience that you're looking forward to applying either on the reporting side, the storytelling side, the scope of what you want to do?
So the next thing that I want to work on, and I can't talk too much about the next show, but it will explore the death industry. So funeral homes. What I'm fascinated by is, 100 years ago or more, we buried our own dead. It was an intimate experience. And we, as a culture, were comfortable with death. We didn't have any other choice. And then, during more than 100 years ago, then way more than 100 years, during the Civil War, embalming was invented. And so Lincoln was the first president to be embalmed so that he could be kind of paraded around the country. And embalming was great because families could see their past soldiers, right? And how have we become a society that turns away from death because we have a lot of hinky feelings about it? And I'm fascinated with that, and I hope the next story explores that. I must say, I think this is true for a lot of journalists. It's true for me. I tend to choose stories that do speak to whatever I'm going through in my own life. I do have the opportunity to choose the stories I do. I don't have an editor necessarily assigning them to me. But even if an editor was assigning stories to me, I would find some way, because you can't tell a story well if you don't personally connect to the material. I think that's true.
Now that you have a deeper understanding of the mechanics of podcasting and what works best in an audio first format, has that shaped how you're thinking about approaching this story?
I learned so much on that first show. And certainly when I go in the field and do reporting for this second show, I'm going to be getting sound that I maybe I didn't know that I needed to be getting this second time around. I think I'll be shutting up a lot more. When you listen to yourself interviewing somebody, it's very cringy. It is for me anyway, because I could really be quiet more often. Lean into the silences of interviews that you're doing. That's kind of what I hope to do.
Can you say more about silence and the role that it plays in interviews? Because I've deployed quite a protracted silence at one point during this interview. I thought it was incredibly effective. But what do you find to be effective about silence, and when and where should it be deployed when you're interviewing people?
Silence is so important because I think we're all uncomfortable with silence. Um, if you're quiet as an interviewer, the person you're interviewing is going to fill that space. Now, I've interviewed people who are uh, knowledgeable about the pregnant pause, and they're not going to play that. They'll just sit there and stare at you, um, which I kind of love because I think, oh, I'm interviewing somebody who's pretty sophisticated and is not just going to run their mouth. But generally, it works pretty nicely. And it does create an intimacy because I think if you're uncomfortable with another person, just for a moment, not in a rude way, it can really bond you. So if you're going to use the silence, use it sparingly because it can make somebody truly uncomfortable and then you won't get what you want. Uh, Use it when you need somebody to open up who you think is probably not going to open up.
Here's some silence right now.
I'm a professional. I'm not falling for it.
Yeah, I mean, you described kind of the train that you're navigating with the next show. Just from a story discovery point of view, which you talked about as well, that you're doing a lot of reading and you see certain stories or elements of stories that have this potential to be much bigger stories. Does that continue to be the case, or as you were exploring and had your feelers out in a discovery mode for what the next project might be, was that new or different from what you've been doing from like a print or featurey approach with the written word, or is it kind of the same process?
It's definitely the same process. I mean, I have a stable of sources. It's a very long list of people, but I tend to kind of if if I'm running dry and I don't have a story idea, I just start to call them, and that's sometimes a month long process because you're having hour and a half long conversations. And just doing that after Suspect ended was great because, I have there are four show ideas that I think are really quality that I got from, calling, I don't know, I probably only called 15 people this time around, but uh, really, really good stories that, once I'm done with this next show, then, maybe I'll tap into those story ideas or pass them along to a colleague or something. But they're all really great. So there's not a big difference really.
Have you thought past the next show to the bigger arc of where do you want to go with your storytelling or what you want to do? Or are you pretty focused on this next show right now?
I'd love to work on a television show. I'd love to work on a television show, even, on a very, very low level, just to see how that works. I'm in an MFA program in narrative nonfiction, and one of my mentors, has written several hit television shows. And I feel like I just learned so much from him already, and I'm so interested in that medium. Um, I would love to do that's kind of a pie in the sky idea, but why not?
And when you say television shows, what type of television shows?
Well, I'm talking about the smarter television that's on, working on, kind of a true detective type of show would be incredible, or something on FX or HBO, something that's high quality. Definitely not the Lifetime channel Women Who Snap, whatever. Not interested in that.
Okay, so you want to do narrative fiction
I
television though? You don't want to do a nonfiction or docuseries type of thing?
I would love to do an adaptation. Well, of course, I would love to do an adaptation of this show that we're getting ready to start work on. So, a show that is actually grounded in nonfiction, but that
Okay.
we can sort of, yeah, that we can add elements to that it brings it out of the pure docuseries format.
And make believe doesn't hold appeal for you?
I'm terrible. I mean, I know you're a talented fiction writer and a writer, great writer in general. I, I've just never been good at writing fiction. Not my thing.
So if you were able to create any TV series, and you might not want to talk about this, but do you have like a fantasy of, if I could do any TV series, this is the thing I would do?
Well, I did mention True Detective. I'm a big fan of that, and I'm super excited that Jodie Foster is playing the detective in season 4. Um, I am still very much attracted to the criminal world and telling stories in that medium. Um, I'm also a big fan of 6 Feet Under, any of these television shows that show us a world that we didn't know anything about before, and kind of break down all of the ideas we might have had about them. I love those.
And what's next for your heart?
Well, I mean, I have this partially collapsed lung and lopsided diaphragm, so I don't know. I'm going to see more specialists, and nobody. I will say this now: I'm never having another operation. No, thank you, because you know I now know that bad things can really happen after operations, and I'm not going there unless it's like so dire. But I feel like after open heart surgery, I mean, bring it.
Yeah, it would be tough for it to be more intense than that. Well, yeah, I mean, here's to hoping that it's all up and to the right from here for the heart, for the career, for the TV series to come, right?
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. And I just hope that I can, you know, still be a good parent and a good partner. I spent so much of my life focused on my career and got married very late when I was 40. And, you know, I would happily put my career aside uh, to focus on, my kid. I really would. I think that would make me a pretty uninteresting person. And I think, you know, I don't think a kid wants you to, devote your life only to them. Seems like bad parenting. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. And I want our kids to get together because I mean, my God, they're the same age. It's ridiculous.
That's right.
I know.
And and the same name,
The
one of
same
them,
name.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How about that?
I know. I've been very careful with her privacy and not saying her name. Um, it's out of respect for her and my husband and also her birth mom. So it's an interesting thing to try to navigate if you have a public facing job.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
And on the public facing side, this is the best transition ever. So, Ashley, if people want to find out more about you, about the show, about what's next, where should they go?
So I would say to go to ashleyfantz.com, and my last name is spelled F as in Frank, ANT as in Tom, Z as in zebra, ashleyfantz.com. That's my website. Or you just hit me up on Twitter. I think Twitter is it's just a soupy landscape of just nastiness, but go ahead. A Fonts is my handle.
All the actions on Mastodon. All right. Well, Ashley, thanks for coming back on Choose the Hard Way, and thanks for everything that you shared today. I appreciate it.
Always. Thank you for having me on again.